It's Friday, the 1st of October. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel, and today we have the preliminary report from the NTSB regarding the crash of the Cessna Citation jet in Farmington, Connecticut last month, killing 4 people on board the aircraft plus one unborn child of one of the passengers, and injuring 4 people on the ground that were in the building that the aircraft crashed into that was occupied at the time. Meanwhile, in other breaking news, just this morning we're getting reports of a mid-air collision in Chandler, Arizona between a helicopter and a fixed-wing aircraft. Chandler, Arizona is a very busy air training airport with 2 parallel runways and an operational control tower. That control tower comes into operation each day about 6 a.m. local. This accident occurred about 7:30 in the morning, so the tower should have been operational during the time of this mid-air collision. We don't know if the fixed-wing aircraft was taking off, landing, or somewhere in the pattern, but the 2 pilots on board the fixed-wing aircraft appear to be fine, and that aircraft is located just off to the side of the runway. The 2 people on board the helicopter were fatally injured. As we get more information, we'll let you know here. This is the preliminary report for the Cessna Citation November 560 Alfa Romeo. The crash occurred on 2 September of this year in Farmington, Connecticut. And here's the big takeaway from this report, as was reported in the media. Examination of the airframe revealed no evidence of any anomalies with any of the airplane's primary or secondary flight control surfaces. Additionally, the parking brake handle in the cockpit and the respective valve that it controlled were both found in the brake set position. In other words, it was found that the parking brake was on. Now let's look at the details. But before we do that, let's go back and review this Cessna Citation crash here in Oroville, California, very near my hometown here. And we talked about this when this accident happened nearly 2 years ago, August 21st of 2019, and from the NTSB, we still only have a preliminary report on this accident. However, these guys survived this accident, and it appears to be a very similar situation. In this case, this crew was taking off from Oroville's Runway 2, a 6,000-foot long runway, but never was able to rotate the aircraft, get the aircraft off the ground. They finally decided very late in the game to reject the takeoff and ended up quite a few feet off of the end of the runway and the aircraft burning. However, they were able to get everybody safely out of the aircraft before the aircraft burned. This also was a Cessna Citation 560XL, and this pilot reported that he was getting ready to take off and he had a change in his clearance, so he stopped the aircraft and set the parking brake, did his clearance change, and then released the parking brake and proceeded to do his takeoff. But as he went to take off, he noticed, he didn't notice it in time that the acceleration was very slow, but he certainly noticed it when he went to rotate, pull back on the elevator, that the aircraft wouldn't rotate at all. The nose would not lift at all. Well, of course, if you have the brakes applied, or if the brakes are being applied, they're applying a nose down force on the aircraft, and they will not allow you to rotate the aircraft up. Another thing, if the parking brake is left full on and you go to advance the throttles on these aircraft, I don't think the Cessna Citation will move if the parking brake is full on and you try to move the aircraft from a dead stop. However, there's something going on with these Cessna aircraft systems and their parking brake that's somehow allowing possibly a partial application of brakes or an incomplete release of the parking brake that we need to be aware of. Unfortunately, in this accident report, this preliminary one from Oroville, there's no indication in this report as to what the condition of the parking brake lever was in when investigators went to study this accident. And it's probably the fact that it was probably burned up in the wreckage and they couldn't tell exactly what the position of the parking brake was in from this wreck. Now back to the preliminary report for 560 Alfa Romeo out of Farmington, Connecticut. Now they're operating out of a much shorter runway, only 3,665 foot long runway, a very short runway for a Cessna Citation. Within the limits of this aircraft's operational performance envelope, especially at this weight and fuel load, however, greatly reducing your safety margins when you operate such a high-performance aircraft on such a short runway. The pilots had filed an IFR flight plan from their hometown airport of Robertson Field to Manteo, if I'm saying that correctly, North Carolina, not a very long flight. 2 witnesses observed the takeoff roll, with one reporting the airplane was going slower than they had seen during previous takeoffs. When the airplane was about 2/3 down the runway, one witness noticed a puff of blue-colored smoke from the backside of the airplane. I presume that's from the tires from the brakes. The other witness stated that the nose landing gear was still on the ground as the airplane passed a taxiway intersection near the midpoint of the runway, and he said to a friend with him that something was wrong. A third witness, who was beyond the departure end of the runway, remember this short runway drops off abruptly at the end down to a street level down below. A third witness, who was beyond the departure end of the runway, noted the airplane departed the runway in a level attitude. After clearing the runway, the airplane's nose pitched up, but the airplane was not climbing. The airplane then impacted a power line pole, which caused a small explosion near the right engine, followed by a shower of softball-sized sparks. After hitting the pole, the noise of the engine went from a normal sounding, in other words, takeoff power sound, to a much more grinding metallic sound. It sounds to me like they're losing the right engine after it hits the power pole. The airplane then began to oscillate about its pitch and roll axis, that's this way and this way, before the witnesses lost sight of it behind the trees. Post-accident examination of the 3,665-foot-long runway revealed tire skid marks from the right main landing gear that were right of the runway centerline, beginning about 2,360 feet from the approach end of the runway. So are they saying at the last 1,000 feet of the runway or so? The mark from the right tire continued, while a mark from the left main landing gear was noted left of the runway centerline, beginning about 2,480 feet from the approach end of the runway. So again, pretty far down the runway. The marks from both main landing gear tires continued and veered slightly to the right, but were continuous from where first observed to the end of the runway and into a short width of grass immediately adjacent to the departure end of the runway. The grassy terrain beyond the departure end of the runway then sloped steeply downward, and the elevation change in the runway and the house was about 20 feet, so it drops off down to the road below. There was a great series of photographs showing this clearly at this accident scene, and I hope that the NTSB has taken their own set of photographs. They have not included that in this preliminary report, but the photographs had since been removed from the poster of the photographs under pressure from the family to not have those pictures posted on anywhere, which slows down the investigation process, but hopefully the NTSB got the same photographs themselves. But in those photos, it showed clearly that I'll get this right here, that the anti-skid braking system was working. So it's a light-colored tire skid mark followed by a very dark chirp, followed by a light skid mark and a dark chirp, indicating that the anti-skid is cycling on and off. It's doing its thing. Now, we'll talk about the systems here in a second. In other words, can anti-skid work with the parking brake on this Cessna series of aircraft? Then they go on to talk about the wreckage and the fact that they found that the parking brake handle in the on position. According to preliminary data recovered from the FDRs, fortunately this aircraft had data on board, flight data recorders, and this helps tremendously with all of these accident investigations. Both thrust levers were set at 66 degrees and both engines remained at 91% N1 throughout the takeoff roll. So they had set takeoff power through the entire takeoff roll. There was not an attempt to reject the takeoff, it looks like, from this data. While at an airspeed of about 100 knots, the elevator control surface position increased to a positive value reaching about 16 degrees. At this time, the pitch of the airplane remained minimally changed to about +1 degree. That's that problem where if the brakes are working, they're applying a nose down force onto the aircraft. You go to rotate the aircraft, it's not going to overcome that braking action, nose down force, and the aircraft simply is not going to rotate. The weight on wheels indication remained in an on-ground state until beyond the departure end of the runway, where the terrain began sloping downward. In other words, the terrain basically fell away from the airplane as they left the end of the runway. After departing the runway at an indicated airspeed of about 120 knots, not fast enough, the elevator position increased to a maximum recorded value of about 17 degrees deflection. So he's honking back on the elevator. The airplane's pitch rapidly increased to about plus 22 degrees. So now with the aircraft free of the ground and the brakes no longer implying that nose down force, the aircraft is able to respond effectively to the elevator input, and it immediately honks it up to 22 degrees. Immediately thereafter, the elevator position rapidly decreased to about minus 1 degree, and the stick shaker aerodynamic stall warning activated. So as soon as he broke ground off the end of the runway at a mere 120 knots, he honks on that up elevator one more time and immediately gets the aircraft into a stalled position. The FDR data further indicated that at about the time the weight on wheels indication transitioned from on-ground in-air to in-air state, the airspeed accelerated from about 120 to a maximum of only 123.75 knots. Just simply not enough speed, and especially when you're honking on the elevator like that and get that high OA, it's not going to accelerate. Additionally, the right engine fuel flow N1 and N2 decreased with the corresponding ITT about 1.8 seconds after the weight on wheels switch was activated. Given the airplane's velocity between the two times, that corresponds with the point at which the aircraft hit the power pole. Parking brake valve position and normal brake application were not recorded on the flight data recorder. It's not on the circuitry. And the airplane's takeoff configuration warning system did not incorporate parking brake valve position as part of its activation logic. And this is something Cessna should reconsider. We'll take a look at the manual here in a minute. On all of our airliner type aircraft, the parking brake is very much a part of the takeoff warning system. It will yell at you that the parking brake is on the moment that you try to attempt to advance the throttles with the parking brake on in an airliner style aircraft. Further review of the FDR data, they were able to, they had stored the last 3 takeoffs. This takeoff, it took the acceleration from 20 knots to 100 knots took 17 seconds. In the previous 2 normal takeoffs, where the brakes were not a problem, that same 20 to 100 knots took 11.5 seconds and 12 seconds respectively. So that brings up the point of minimum acceleration check speed. Now, unless you were a military-trained pilot and were fortunate enough to fly something very high performance like the T-38 trainer, the concept of minimum acceleration check speed might be lost on you. The T-38 taught us through a lot of accidents just how critical these takeoff numbers are. And the only way you can validate your takeoff data, V1, rotate V2 in airline parlance, it was called something different in the T-38. The only way you can verify that data, that data is based on an indicated airspeed. The only way you could verify it was to do a minimum acceleration check speed. And in the T-38, we were trained that the first number we needed to check was at the 2,000-foot marker. You had to have obtained a certain airspeed. You had all these speeds calculated and on your knee board right there with you as you take off. So say, for example, at 2,000 feet, you needed to be indicated a minimum of 100 knots. That number validates your takeoff data. That means all systems are go. Everything is accelerating normally to make the rest of your takeoff data valid. If you are dragging a brake or if you have some kind of a wind shear phenomenon, these sorts of things can invalidate your takeoff data because your takeoff data is based on an indicated airspeed. And the shorter runway you're operating out of, the less margin of error you have for inaccurate takeoff data. And more critical is the decision to reject the takeoff. It's a split-second decision when it comes down to these short runways and high-performance aircraft. Nothing got my blood pressure pumped up more than, man, the initial solo in a T-38 aircraft for the Air Force. I just was just sitting there praying that everything worked perfect on this aircraft, because if things go wrong in these sort of high-performance aircraft right at that critical phase of flight, well, at least we had an ejection seat in these airplanes. And this acceleration check speed applies to single-engine aircraft as well. Every year we have loads of single-engine takeoff accidents where the aircraft simply does not become airborne or hits obstacles off of the end of the runway. They exceed the performance limitations of their aircraft. They're not checking either the data for the takeoff initially, or they're not checking their speed, their acceleration down the runway as they go to take off. And here on the Bold Method, a website that I highly recommend, they review the 50-70 rule that says that by the halfway mark on the runway, you should have 70% of your flying takeoff speed. For example, if you got a takeoff speed of 80 miles an hour, 70% of 80 is 56. So halfway down the runway, you should see at least 56 indicated airspeed by the time you're halfway down the runway. And this is a technique that's often used by bush pilots in short field operations as well. Here's a quick look at the Cessna Citation power brake and anti-skid schematic. The brakes are actuated like most aircraft, toe brakes. Push the top of the rudder pedals here, and that brake pressure then goes through a power brake valve, an anti-skid servo valve, then past the parking brake check valve, and then into the shuttle valve for the individual wheel brakes. And of course, that's also controlled by a digital anti-skid control unit, which releases the brakes if they indicate a locked position, anti-skid. So when you apply the parking brake, I understand on the Citation is just like any other Cessna. You push on the top of the rudder pedals and you pull the parking brake. And to release the parking brake, all you got to do is push this handle in. However, is there a condition where you may have some partial brake pressure trapped in downstream of this parking brake check valve? I can see that if the parking brake is full on, you are pressing the toe brakes and trapping fluid here in the brake system, and then trapping that fluid with the parking brake check valve. But if you release the parking brake and yet still have some brake fluid pressure applied into the braking system, I could also see how the anti-skid would be allowed to operate with this partial pressure situation. This is something I think Cessna needs to take a look at and needs to come up with some guidance for operators out there in the field. Here's another excerpt from the manual, and something that I think Cessna should consider as a result of these two accidents. The takeoff warning system, here in parentheses, the parking brake also contributes to the no takeoff condition on certain European registered aircraft. But apparently not all the aircraft, and not all the aircraft here in the U.S. Again, most airliners always have the parking brake as part of the takeoff warning system. Now let's take a look at the Model 560 checklist. Before taxi checklist, there's no reference to the parking brake in the before taxi checklist. Maybe it's because it's so obvious that you're not going to move if the parking brake is on. This is speed brake reference, not brakes or parking brake reference. And the taxi checklist, there is item number 3, brakes checked. They want you to make sure that the brakes are working. In other words, tap on the brakes, pretty normal procedure for most aircraft. Make sure the brakes are working, and they have this caution here: if during taxi a hard brake pedal, no braking condition is encountered, operate the emergency brake system as required. Correct prior to flight. Yeah, your brakes are not working. Use the e-brake to stop the aircraft and get it fixed. And then before takeoff, again, no reference to parking brake on that either. So this may be something for Cessna to consider in the form of a bulletin, to consider adding releasing the parking brake to this checklist, even though it sounds like a no-brainer. that might need to be added to the checklist. And then if the park and brake was added onto the checklist, depending on what checklist you add it to, if you get out there on the end of the runway, and I just hate doing this, you get out there, first off, I do not like getting cleared onto the runway and then holding on the runway on the numbers while you're waiting for something else to happen, because you can't see the aircraft behind you, what's going on behind you. If you're in the run-up area and you set the parking brake and then release it, if the parking brake was in one of the checklists, did you just reopen a whole nother checklist? You got to go back and redo the taxi checklist, before takeoff checklist, once you set and then release a parking brake in the holding area? Most folks don't do that. They just set the parking brake, do their thing, and then release the parking brake and blast off. But how do you know that that parking brake is completely released in this model of aircraft? Here's the Google map of the Farmington airport. Distance checks about 3,600 feet. The weather was good. Winds were 12 knots out of the north, so a good headwind departing on runway 02. This aircraft ended up impacting that Trump building right in the corner there, a total of 5,000 feet from the departure, the beginning of the runway. These brake skid marks were visible on about the last third of the runway. And if we drop down onto the street below, we can see that's the power pole that the aircraft hit right there. It's not a very tall power pole, and it's located almost, well, probably level with, or maybe even, it's not very high up above the runway surface, as this runway drops off a good 20 feet down to the street surface down below. So this was the power pole that they hit, and then down the road here is where they ended up impacting the corner of the Trump building. So what are some of the important takeaways I've learned from this accident and this preliminary accident report? From an operational view, one, get the concept down of a minimum acceleration check speed. Are you accelerating correctly for this departure? And that's 50-70 rule for single engine aircraft. Are we getting 70% of your needed takeoff airspeed by the midpoint of the runway? Also, too, the use of the parking brake. Once I've released that parking brake from where the aircraft was parked, I don't like to use that parking brake again. Just hold the brakes off the end of the runway if you need to, and if you've got a second pilot and you're creeping forward, have him holler at you while you're writing down clearances instead of using the parking brake at all once you've come out of the parking area. For Cessna aircraft, do we need to reconsider some service bulletins or a rewrite of the checklist? Do we need to really add the parking brake into some of those checklists? Also, too, what about the wiring of the takeoff warning system? Do we need to consider harmonizing the design such that all the aircraft, not just the European aircraft, have the parking brake as part of the takeoff warning system? And three, what's going on with the parking brake shuttle valve there? Is there something in that system that's allowing a partial brake pressure application, an incomplete release of all parking brake pressure from the brake system? Thanks so much for your support of this channel, especially over on Patreon, that make this content possible. See you here.